All right, well, so I'm Greg Lynn. We're here in Los Angeles in my office. I lately have been really dividing my time between architecture, robotics, and to some extent, a little bit of industrial design. So I spend more time on the robots right now than on the architecture, but I'm very refreshed. Every time I start working on a building, it makes me so happy, and I really enjoy it a lot compared to being a CEO of a robotics company, which I also enjoy a lot. But it's much more pressure, much more of a challenge, and frankly, much for me higher stakes in a lot of ways. So right now, kind of that's where I'm at, doing a lot of stuff as well as teaching at UCLA and the Angewandte, where both places. I'm having my 20th anniversary at the Angewandte, which is kind of incredible to me, and have been at UCLA even longer. So I was raised from the moment I was tiny, like before I even knew about having a job, my mother decided I should be an architect. So my entire life I spent not only, drawing, sketching, painting, building models, stuff like that, but also learning how to draw plans and elevations and axonometrics. I mean, before I even went to high school, I knew how to draw axonometric drawings and was even drawing kind of conical threaded, like more or less like Guarini or something. I was already learning how to draft all that and could draw like a 3-point perspective while I was in high school. So in terms of exposure to architecture, I lived in Ohio, Northern Ohio, traveled a lot with my family. They love to travel. And usually when we'd go to a hockey tournament or go visit family in Milwaukee, my mother in particular would always take me to see a Frank Lloyd Wright building like Johnson Wax, or take me to see mostly American early modernists. But so I did get to see some amazing buildings as a kid and understood what architecture was like. Probably didn't understand the fundamental thing about architecture, which is the cultural and civic part of it. But I definitely got a big taste for the technical part and the part of it where you have to be an artist and do something that's kind of amazing and impressive and inspiring and all that. I definitely understood what that was to be an architect as a little kid. Well, for my generation, the place I feel related to, it's a hard question because Ohio is a huge population state and with what were big cities. But for me, the narrative was always that you would leave, that you would go somewhere else to do something bigger from out of Ohio. So I spent, if you include undergraduate school, I spent 20 years in Ohio. I then went to New Jersey, where I was a graduate student at Princeton, and then because I was into a club called Maxwell's where they had a lot of music, and I used to go up every 2 weeks anyway to see music. I ended up moving across the street from this club Maxwell's and lived in Hoboken for another maybe 12 years, something like that. And then came to LA where I've been for maybe 21, 22 years. So it's not quite a third, but those places I feel related to, wouldn't say I'm from any of them, to be totally honest. I mean, I feel like a misfit in every place. I taught for 3 years in Zurich and have been teaching 20 years in Vienna and feel very connected, especially to Vienna and the architecture and cultural milieu of Vienna. But, I would say to me that network is more significant than any place, that I really feel like I strive to be globally aware, and I really seek out interesting people in other places. And I've always been very quick to get on an airplane and just go spend time with people that I'm interested in and respect and kind of learn from them, whether they're older, younger, whatever. I'm interested in that, and so I really feel like my network is where I feel comfortable. During COVID, it was very difficult for me to lose that personal connection with that network. And I'm trying to rebuild all that now, but it was the thing I missed the most. It wasn't really being in one place. It was the fact that I wasn't connected to all my colleagues. I always feel, for me anyway, the world's very, very small. And I feel like as much as I try to step out of the network of people I know and learn something new, I'm then finding out that those people know all the people I know. And in culture and design and architecture, these are very, very small worlds. I think if you're in other industries, maybe those worlds are a little bit bigger, but just forget architecture, but just architecture and design, you could kind of meet, like you're doing it right now with these interviews, you could meet that whole world in a few years if you really put your mind to it. So, and it's very easy when you have someone you want to meet to get to meet that person. And then if there's any kind of creative or intellectual synergy, then you start, talking and collaborating. And so, yeah, for me, the world's too small. And I don't think it has anything to do with big cities. So geographically, I mean, I do always feel like there's a time when I know it's the moment to get out of a place. Like for me in New York, I was very motivated to just get out of there because I saw something happening and I just saw things disappearing really quickly, mostly actually music clubs. But I also gauge kind of the health of a place by its music scene. And music drives everything. I mean, it drives every decision we make is usually connected in some way to music. And so even though I don't have a great knowledge of music, I do monitor what was going on. And when the music scene in New York died, I thought, well, New York's dead as a cultural place now. I need to get out. And so that I have a little wanderlust, but I don't really have a strong connection to places in that way. I like to make my own little world too. I mean, because I'm so much more connected to, let's say, people than places, I think of mentors as being very important. As an undergraduate, there were a few people that were very instrumental in keeping me connected to design and architecture, because I kind of felt like once I got away from the more or less a stage mother who wanted me to be an architect and went to university in architecture, and because it was skill-based for the first 2 years where I went, it was really easy for me in studio because they were teaching us just skills. And so I started taking philosophy classes and kind of took care of all my requirements in a philosophy program and was really interested actually in being more of a academic, working with more kind of abstract things and not in the physical world of design. And was about to leave, and then there were several people from, the person who was the director of the school, like Bob Benson, really worked hard to keep me in the school, but also some very key visitors, like a really young person who just graduated from Harvard and RISD, John Bass, came as a visiting teacher. And they kind of inspired me to stay in the field, as well as like there were 3 nights of consistent lectures by John Haydick, which I was blown away by. But it really was important for me to see other people and not so much get encouragement from them, but just get inspired by them to keep in the field. And I do need that kind of connection to watching other people all the time. At Princeton, it was also a moment of big change. I went there kind of wanting to, mostly I wanted to go there just to make trouble, because I thought that Michael Graves' early work I was so interested in. But then the later work I was so disinterested in. And I thought, well, I'm going to go there and I'm going to try to learn from Michael from his early work. Which he was completely uninterested in teaching me. So I had a lot of like friction while I was at Princeton. But while I was there, Michael Hayes started teaching there for the first time. Bob Maxwell, who's an underrated dean at Princeton, really transformed the school very quietly. I mean, he minimized the role of Michael Graves and hiring people from his orbit, and instead started bringing in people like Michael Hayes, eventually brought in Beatrice Colomina. It was a real shift at the school, and it was the moment of the deconstructivist architecture show. So there were important mentors there, but more than the faculty, it was my students that I was with. That's where I met Stan Allen, and through Stan I met Jesse and Hani Rashid and Ben Nicholson and all these people. Kevin Kennan was a student there with me, Sarah Whiting, Ed Mitchell. Honestly, just too many people to name, but of my graduating class of like 12, I'm still really close friends and have collaborated with at least half those people, and the people above me and below me as well. So that group, it was a different time. I mean, it was when Philip Johnson, who I loathed at the time because of the Spaeth book and the awareness of what he did as a Nazi sympathizer. I was very anti-Philip Johnson. And when I worked for Peter Eisenman, I would actually see Philip Johnson champion architecture at a level that I didn't know existed. And I would also see that even though Michael Graves and Peter Eisenman, at a certain level, kind of hated each other because they both wanted a job at Princeton, and Michael got it and Peter didn't, and they were very competitive and took very different tracks. When they needed to, they were totally supportive of each other. And they're with the Charlottesville tapes and all these things, architects really kind of almost unionized to try to elevate the field as much as they could. And even though they had to compete, they were always trying to work with the cities, work with the developers, work with the institutions to make things better for the group, because they knew if the group would do better, that eventually they would individually do better. And they did that internationally. I mean, lots of European architects, Japanese architects, there was South American architects. There were a lot of connections between certain key places on the globe with that group, and they really worked together. And I think people like Jesse and Nanico and Alejandro and Farshid, we all kind of watched that and realized, even though we were all competing for the same stuff, Caroline and Ben Van Berkel, we thought, let's work together at some level to try to like raise all of us at once rather than fighting with each other. Now, that still, it exists, but it's very different than it was then in the 80s and 90s. Because it actually was very powerful then. And the institutions understood that, the developers understood that. So, you know, and there were figures who were able to force that. Well, I would say there's two tracks about the digital shift. So, and autobiographically, the first shift for me was just, you know, as a teenager, like as a high school kid, I guess, maybe junior high school kid, I had like a Commodore 64. Well, first of all, video games. Like I started off as a young kid, like just pumping quarters into Asteroids and Galaga and all these arcade games, which were digital. So, I mean, just to date myself, I used to play pinball when I would go to a hockey tournament, and I was like 11 years old or something. At a certain point, I started putting quarters into things with screens and playing video games with joysticks. So very soon after that, those things all came to game consoles with cartridges. And very quickly after that, it came to the first personal computers. So Commodore, Atari, and then an early IBM. I had all those earliest computers where you would, you know, have to code in like, line 10, hi, this is Greg, line 20, print, and you would save it to a cassette tape and print it on a dot matrix printer. So, that shift in digital entertainment, very simple, like, coding, and then using that for drafting, all happened before I even, like while I was an undergraduate. I had like an IBM, not even an XT, like an AT or whatever they call them, which I would use for my school projects. And I wasn't getting taught that by the university. I was just using it because it was like the video game stuff. It just seemed like a thing to experiment with. So for me, that digital medium was just happening. Like everybody knew that was happening. The question was just, how would you use it in whichever field you were in? And so for me, it was an inevitability that it was going to come into architecture. I wasn't really taught it at that point because there were not courses about it. There was no instruction. It was also seen as very vocational, like for draftspeople, not for designers. But that was one thing. The most important thing, I would say, to go back to people like Michael Hayes, was assemblage was just starting. There were these INI conferences just starting. There were all kinds of conferences where Charles Jenks at the AA was doing these conferences, where people from the Santa Fe Institute, people from the sciences mostly, but that were simulating biology with computers, were coming to these conferences, and we were kind of seeing what they were doing. And theorists were starting to talk about models of knowledge and logic that had an affiliation with digital things loosely. I mean, people like Mark Taylor, maybe. I mean, people that maybe don't seem so critical right now, they were starting to do this stuff. And then Columbia gets all the credit, but I mean, in the Netherlands, there was two very important organizations doing digital technology. There was Ars Electronica. There were, Santa Fe Institute, I mentioned. These places were all doing the same things that Columbia were doing. So there was a network of people, mostly from architecture, like Nobotic Research from the Netherlands, and studios like that were architecture studios, but doing digital environments. So my mentors, people like Catherine Ingraham, Jennifer Bloomer, Cynthia Davidson, Ann Berggren, people that were all involved in publishing, who were, asking me to write articles and helping me edit them. Michael Hayes, that was one group of people that pushed the digital, but in their own way, without really understanding digital technology, they were pushing it. And then there was this resource of just growing up on video games with personal computers that I also knew. So that's really what happened. And I think my role in all that was through publications and projects, I was probably able to articulate potential in that technology in a way that other people weren't. And I understood that was my role. And so for me, the paperless studios were important, but also publishing in assemblage and going to any conferences, and that was equally important. So at that time, I was really just trying to make some clear concepts that people could adopt. It was also a time where there were these kind of, I won't name names, but like futuristic people, like people promising like, liquid space and, kind of like Lawnmower Man type experiences, which I think did kind of come true, but I didn't want to be like a futurist. I actually wanted to be more like because I had a philosophy degree, I just wanted to articulate concepts clearly and then have the most impact I could in as many fields as possible, which is what a philosopher would try to do. So that was really my role at Columbia at the time. Bernard really believed in the power of ideas. And so with, I'm like, I maybe need another coffee, but I think Newsline, I think it was Skyline first and then became Newsline. But Stephen Perella, who is the editor of Newsline, was very good at that marketing, for sure. But the best people at the marketing were all the graduates, the people you interviewed. And it's true, but it was possible at that point to be like 25 years old and say, well, my boss doesn't know how to use a computer and I did everything. So like, oh, like this person, for this project, like, sure, they kind of like got, talked to the clients and had the office and everything. Because I know the computer from Columbia, I'm the person that designed it. There was a whole lot of that. And there was a whole lot of offices that were like, well, we're the discount Frank Gary's or we're the young whoever's. And they would just promote the shit out of Columbia. And so that I think it's more that network was very good at promoting itself. I mean, and also there were then suddenly every school is like, I need one of these people on my faculty. And the place you could go to get them was Columbia. And so like they took over the world really quick. But there were a lot of other places with a lot of other interesting things going. The one thing I think Bernard was brilliant about was covering his bets. So instead of saying, we're going to use this as a design tool, which was really kind of why I was there, or instead of using this as a visualization and like a new virtual environment, which was what Hani and Lizanne were very interested in, or instead of using this as a drawing, let's say as a disciplinary drawing tool, which is what Nanako and Jesse were doing, he really spread his bets out. He even said, what about as a manufacturing tool, which was what, say, Scott Marble, people like that were doing. There was just no space to actually get a CNC mill. Like the one in that room is like that vintage still, it's 30 years old, but there was no room to physically put it in the building. But Bernard really did say like, here's 4 or 5 tracks and let's try them all. And let's also see how they interact with each other. And so for me, that was what the genius was, rather than most other universities just picked one. They said like, we're a corporate school that trains architects to run firms, so let's just focus on it as a drafting tool. So some schools would do that. Other schools would say, we're like a school that wants to make sure we're up to date with our drawing as a medium. And so let's focus on that. But Bernard just kind of did all of it and tried it. It was a big enough school. He was growing the school, so he could afford to do that. Yeah, well, so the embryological house project was a self-initiated thing, which I wanted to do as a kind of a test of a concept. And a lot of things came together at that particular moment. So I was learning the principles of calculus, let's say, because I didn't really, didn't have mathematical expertise. So I learned the principles of calculus where you could have an equation which you could infinitesimally subdivide forever. And so I thought, oh, well, so let's design, like I just started with a curve, like let's start with a curve and figure out how to use that curve to drive an infinite number of points along that curve that you could control. And so I very simply set up, which was just drafting, honestly, a family of curves which could be lofted into an envelope where you could mix and match those curves to get to, gosh, I think it was 9 to the 9th power or something like that. So somewhere around 50,000, I forget the exact number. But you could have 50,000 envelopes which would all work in terms of area. So I thought, oh, it's like, if the ideal villa was something to which nothing could be added or subtracted, I thought, well, let me design the ideal villa. There'll just be 50,000 of them that'll all be ideal. So that was really the start of it. And then I'd been using, maybe for a couple of years, Wavefront and Alias, and because Softimage was bought by Microsoft, Autodesk bought Alias and Wavefront and put them together in this package Maya. And so Wavefront was a very script-driven simulated physics package, and Alias was a surface modeling package. But when they came together in Maya, you could use the MEL scripts, so you could use that scripting language for the fluid dynamics and gravitational simulation that was in Wavefront. You could apply that all to surfaces, to the control points and surfaces. So it treated a CV, a control vertices point, the same way that it treated a particle. And so I thought, oh, well, like now suddenly this whole scripting language is available now for me to take these 50,000 curves, or these 50,000 surfaces made out of these 9 curves, and I can now like drive windows, panelization, structural members, all that stuff using the MEL script. So for me, it was like the kind of CFD scripting language with the surface modeling, understanding that these splines were all defined by points that could suddenly be particles, and putting it together into one project where I could design these 50,000, this group. I mean, I've never even seen all 50,000 of them, but we've definitely modeled them. They exist in a 3D file. I've just never bothered to look at all of them, but I know they're all equally beautiful. And to take that and then drive it into tectonics. So, which now, by the way, like you do every day. Like the embryological house is like my day-to-day, like turn on the computer and that's what's sitting on the desktop. So there's a debate I have with everybody all the time, and I can't believe that I still can't get this across. Because this is what Peter Eisenman said about the embryological house, is he said, but how do you have judgment? They can't all be equally good. And I said, no, that's the whole point. He said, that's impossible. And then I remember I did the Arc of the World project, and Peter said, why don't you go back to those embryological houses? They were all so beautiful. So, I mean, for me, judgment starts at the beginning. Like, it's not, so many people, think that you make a mess and then judgment comes in and says, wow, that's a lot of mess, but I'm an expert and that's the good one. So for me, judgment doesn't work that way. I couldn't behave that way because I don't want to spend 90% of my life making messes and 10 minutes judging it. For me, it was cooked in the first 9 curves, which were sketched and then drafted in 2D and then arrayed in 3D and then tempered, in terms of design. And I did sit and design those with other people, but mostly I sat myself and designed them. Like, judgment was cooked in. It was cooked into the thing. And then judgment didn't stop then. It's not like then it's some machine and you just like make sausages with it. Like, I was judging the whole way through. But digital technology is not some black box that makes a mess and then I step in and judge. And frankly, a lot of people treat it that way. But for me, it's judgment all day, every day. The majority of my time is spent on Piaggio Fast Forward. And it's because we're growing fast and we have an approach to machines, but to robotics, which is very much like an approach to architecture in the sense that it's robots that augment people, robots that follow and understand how people move, robots that understand the built environment so they can detect and drive through doors, and they know what curbs, they know what the built environment is. So unlike every other robotics company, frankly, which is focusing on like driving a machine from point to point in a map and how do we build a map of the whole world, our robots are, I know that's a person, I can tell they're going to turn the corner. I know how far away to stay from them. I know how close to stay. I know how to go through a door. Like, we're doing that, and we're the only company doing it. And so it's very, very high pressure. And we're growing very fast. But we can't grow fast enough, because I think we need to capitalize on this opportunity now, or else it could honestly disappear. I mean, we're starting to see some big companies take the same approach. I won't say copying us, but definitely taking the same approach. And for me, it's very exciting to have competitors that are agreeing with us that this is a better approach to robots than like things that are going to just throw packages over your fence or through your window or something like that. Like, it's a much more interesting thing to have machines that help you be a better human and a better person than machines that are going to like fire packages through the window so you can order them on your phone. So the two places I teach, I have very good teams that have been with me for a long time teaching with me. And for me, it's really teaching people to be civic leaders and to think about the built environment at a big scale and look at technology and culture and politics, and to say, like, this is where architecture could have a role. So previously I was teaching maybe more vocationally, like, here's some tools and here's a formal language and build a model using this machine or that machine. Now I'm really saying the world is spatially changing, and buildings and the built environment should be part of that conversation. And so all these places, I try to bring in collaborators, from Disney or Boeing or Arrivals who we're working with now, to say, like, what are cities doing? What's the built environment doing? And how can you all be connected to that conversation? So before somebody just says, here's a program and a site, design me a building, that you could actually have a conversation before you get to that point. And everywhere I go, that's where I teach. It's funny, I've been teaching this seminar for the last few years where we try to summarize an architect's core competency in one sentence. And one of my students picked Corbusier, and they said that Corb wanted to be the most important modern architect by articulating it in 5 easy to copy points. And the student, I asked them to have 2 images to illustrate that, and they illustrated it, one with the Villa Savoye and the other with Gwathmey's parents' house, instead of 2 Corb projects. They said Corb's greatest achievement was that not only he could do the 5 points to do Villa Savoye, but it was so easy to copy that, everybody could do it. So, and then here's a copy of it. Not a copy literally of the Villa Savoye, but a copy of the 5 points. So I've always thought that you want to give everything away. Like, I didn't have a patent until very recently, but I've always thought, if you have a good idea, make it as simple to copy as possible. And so I would always go to, whether it was Autodesk or Maya, Alias, Wavefront, all these places that were doing cutting edge programming and packages for other fields. I would go and I would really listen, rather than like talk about myself. I would just listen and try to condense what they were doing into something, and then bring it back into architecture and explain, like, oh, computational fluid dynamics fundamentally is based on modeling with agents and particles rather than shapes. And you use fields and you use agents, and then you see what patterns emerge from that. And so I could explain that in architecture, and then I could connect people with the tools and say, this is the tool to use, and these are probably the things you might want to use a tool like that with in architecture. So, and I would teach as many people as I could. I would make it as simple as possible. I would go to conferences and explain it in a way that everybody could leave the room and understand. Whereas I have to say most other people were trying to keep things very secret. I also thought things would take a lot longer because at the time, what we were doing at Columbia, everybody was saying, this stuff is never going to take off. You know, and architects were saying, like, I'll always draw with a pencil. Like, I'll use a computer for the idiots that do my drafting, but creatively, I'll never use a computer. And I remember we all kind of thought that. Like, I mean, sitting around, you know, with this group of, you know, maybe 7 or 8 offices, you know, most of them were run by multiple people that were all friends. We kind of thought we had like an infinite amount of time. And then I remember it was actually Peter Pran, who I don't even know what happened to Peter Pran, but he was running big corporate office out of like Minnesota or something like that. All of a sudden we saw these projects which were like really close to what we all wanted to be doing. And I was just like, this corporate firm we never heard of is using all this technology and building these kind of crazy buildings. Like, what's going on? And then every corporate firm jumped on it super fast. Like, you know, and it just all of a sudden I realized, wow, like this moves a lot faster than you think. Like if you listen to the people that tell you it's not going to work, you can sometimes just get left behind because actually people are going to see the value in this and adopt it really quick. So that was one thing I learned late. Like I was probably 40 years old when I realized that ideas are powerful and that they actually do get picked up. Like I thought I was just going to be speaking into the void forever, but in fact what was happening is a lot of the things that I saw as opportunities, so did a lot of other people independently. So I realized things move quick and you got to move things quick. So when I went to the ETH, it was a very conservative place. And I mean, Switzerland, you can't stereotype entire countries, but they're a place that like thinks about the long play. They don't really think about innovation so much, at least they didn't then. And there was not a lot going on with robotics there. But I was hired by the president of the university and more or less forced on the Department of Architecture. And there were not a lot of people that were excited that I was there, or that I had, you know, CNC mills and robotic equipment in the building. But I remember Hans Kohlhoff came and said, can you use this stuff for making decoration? And we said, yeah, it's actually, that's what kind of everybody does first. Like Bernard Kesch invented this stuff and he did it to invent algorithmic decoration. And Kohlhoff was like, I'm really interested in this stuff. And so it was amazing to me that despite hostility and suspicion, that there was the most conservative person in the school saw an opportunity there. And I mean, I think, you know, there was, I don't think a lot of like alignment there, but there was definitely a mutual respect and an openness. And so I think that's really all it takes. But yeah, if everybody postures against each other, then yeah, you can have that kind of stuff shut out for a long time. I mean, there's lots of schools. Architecture is also a field where you don't need to innovate. I mean, that recent history proves that. I mean, lots of people are happy to be in a building that looks like it was designed, that tries to look like it was designed 100 years ago. So you can have a job being like a Neanderthal and be successful because people want to live in a cave. So that's fine. I mean, like with every other field, people demand cutting edge, but in architecture, people are happy with nostalgia. So it's a field that tolerates a lack of innovation, and professionally, it's a field whose major stories are all of tragedy. You know, like Howard Rourke and your vision that's not understood by people. And, you know, if like you're in high school and you tell your guidance counselor, you got all these big visions, but you think you'll fail, they're like, well, architecture is a perfect place for you because you're supposed to struggle. And it's filled with tragedy and disappointment. So if you can tolerate that and keep going, then this is a good field for you. So entire schools can be 50 years behind, no problem, and still be successful. Architecture tends to lead what's going to work in culture. So I remember car companies hanging around in the 90s saying like, well, all these programs were built for us, but we don't trust them. Like I remember Volvo brought, I think it was maybe Lindy Roy and maybe Sanford Quinter and I forget who all went there, but we were brought to Volvo's headquarters to meet their designers. And they're like, well, we've just been designing boxes. Like our cars are all rectangular boxes. And we started using Alias and like, look at our new designs and tell us what you think. And we want to have showrooms where people come tell our car architects what kind of car they want. And the car architects from a kit of parts can make a one-of-a-kind car coming off the line. And this is the future of cars for us. And they more or less were telling us back what we had been saying for a long time. And same thing in fashion. You know, the kind of greatest fashion designers that I was colleagues with at the Angewandte, they're very interested in being there because they're with architects. And, you know, kind of decon in architecture was way ahead of decon in fashion. And industrial design, forget it. I mean, they're always, the best industrial designers are typically 20 years after architecture in terms of like language, like formal language. So I think architecture's ahead, it's just they don't recognize it and they don't maybe quite exploit it the way that other fields do. But it's also the most culturally connected field. Like the built environment is like, what's more important than the built environment? Like the design of your phone or your car is not as important as the built environment. It's civic. And so if it works in architecture, it's going to work everywhere else. And if it doesn't work in architecture, everybody's very cautious about it. Because if they won't accept it in the built environment, then how are they going to accept it in a product? So, but I've always found industrial designers to be very, well, most good design companies are led by people that were trained in architecture. I mean, that used to be the only way you could be an industrial designer was to go to architecture school. It's very recent. You could go get a design degree. I mean, recent, like 100 years old. But so still a lot of architects are in design fields and they're very open. So you can go, I mean, Nike's very connected with architecture schools around the world. Arrival, very cool new company, very connected with architecture. So I find design and architecture to be very connected up.